Okay, my name is Bruce Barnes. I'm with the New Bedford Preservation Society. Going to do a pretty cool area of the city today, kind of a very, very hidden treasure for the city, the neighborhood that's mostly Grove, and then around the corner to Hawthorn. But the Grove Street houses I don't think I've ever done on the tour before, and so that's sort of new for me and for you as well. But I want to start here at the Grinnell Mansion. It's good parking here for the most part, so it's a good place to start. And it's a very interesting house. The Grinnell Mansion is really one of the signature buildings for the city that was built during the whaling industry. 1830, Joseph Grinnell was one of the big movers and shakers in New Bedford during his lifetime. He had worked, originally he worked in the counting houses of the Rotches and the Rodmans, the early big-time whalers here in New Bedford. But then he and his brothers moved to New York, actually, in the around 1810 or so, and became very successful importers and exporters of goods at the time when New York was becoming the hub of commerce in the country. And they took advantage of that and became very successful. And Joseph decided that he would come back to New Bedford. His two brothers stayed in New York City and became considerably wealthy men. His younger brother, whose name was Moses Grinnell, was one of the richest entrepreneurs in New York City in the early years of before the Civil War. Anyway, but Joseph came back, had plenty of cash, lots of ambition. And in around 1830, he hired an architect who was pretty famous in the South Coast named Russell Warren, and he built this house. Beautiful Greek-style house, one of the first of the big stone mansions here in New Bedford. As much as this is a great house, some of the other stone mansions that were built and some of the other buildings that were designed by Russell Warren, which include the Double Bank building, the Public Library building, the Rotch Rodman house across the street, a few other major buildings here in the city. This one here is kind of the plainest of them all. I guess it's more of a pure architectural building as a Greek temple and so forth, but it's not as ornate and as decorative as some of the others. But one of the interesting things about the siding on this building and all the granite in this building, it's from the very, very famous Quincy quarry in Massachusetts. This bluish cast, as you can see here, this is days now when most granite wasn't that colorful, like they can get all these great colors these days from the big mines in South America and so forth. So granite was basically the gray color that we see on most of the mills and so forth and the other buildings. But the Quincy granite had this bluish cast to it. You can see it here now still after almost 200 years of this house being built. And Quincy granite was very famous in its day. It was commissioned and specified for lots of projects throughout the country, really. Done some work on other architects in other parts of the country, and they specified this granite to be shipped to Philadelphia and South Carolina and Savannah and so forth for projects. So it was a big deal. I think it's the only building that still stands that has Quincy granite still, this bluish cast. Anyway, that's one of the nice features of the house. Grinnell was a very big mover and shaker. He was born in 1888, and didn't die until 1885. So he's 97 years old. He was responsible for lots of things. The first railroad that came to New Bedford in 1840, the water system, the public drinking supply, water supply, which was installed during the 1860s. He was instrumental in getting that off the ground. He was the owner of the first very, very successful textile mill, the Wamsutter Mill. So he was a big deal throughout his whole life. And he was really one of the most important men living in New Bedford throughout the 19th century. It's Anthony Street, 1 to 3 Anthony Street's multifamily. This has been on the house tour in the past. It's always been in tip-top shape. I haven't been inside, as I said, but the outside's always been in tip-top shape. Beautiful building in the mostly the Greek Revival style, although they put on, at some point during the Victorian period, they put on the Specacular Porch. I mean, it takes a little bit away from its Greek Revival origins, but it's so beautiful that it makes the house really quite grand, actually. Built about 1843. Color scheme has always been that way since I've known it, about 25, 30 years. It's always been this color scheme. It's good, historically accurate color scheme. Beautiful house. Now, Anthony Street, this is what this street is here, is named after a man by the name of Joseph Anthony. And he built a house on the block that's behind us here, which stretches from Grove to Hawthorn and is bordered on east and west by Cottage and Orchard. One house was on that street, and it was a big Greek revival like the one we just went to, Joseph Anthony. He was born in the late 1790s, but he died young in 1840. And his house was sold to somebody else. His name was Joseph Delano. He remodeled the house into a spectacular building as well. And the whole site was like RJD as well. Beautiful gardens, beautiful outbuildings, and so forth. And by the time the last of the Delanos passed away, it was during the Great Depression. There was no money to even buy the property, never mind restore it, keep it going. And so the main house was torn down. These, as you can look, when you look at these houses here, you can all see that most all of them post-war houses after the Great Depression, after World War II. And that's why they have this gigantic development almost. It doesn't seem to fit in house-wise with the rest of them. But nonetheless, that's what Anthony Street comes from Joseph Anthony. And that's what happened to this site here. But this house has survived. Beautiful house, about 1843, which would have been just after Joseph Anthony's death. So probably they put the street in during that time as well. And because some other houses on the block, which we're not going to go down and see, but they're about the same age, 1840. So that's probably when this street was put in and named after Joseph Anthony. Another interesting fact about Anthony, if you're interested in New Bedford's history, is he wrote a diary that's been published. It was called New Bedford 100 years ago. 100 years ago was from 1925. So the diary spans from early 1820s to just before his death. And the thing about, there's been a couple of diaries written that are important in New Bedford's history, one by Samuel Rodman and Joseph Anthony's is the other. And Anthony's is very, very jolly. It's very almost sassy. Talks about all the parties he went to. He talks about taking his bride in his sleigh with his girlfriends and his wife and so forth. It's very different. He talks about the great divide that happened in the Quaker religion at the time, but he's kind of smart ass about it, really. He makes fun of what was going on and stuff. Very, very interesting take on things. Joseph Anthony, he was probably a funny guy to be around because he certainly loved life, it appears, and had a good time doing it. He was a whaling, he worked in the counting houses of the big whalers and actually had his own counting house at some point at the end of his life. I guess the only thing bad about Joseph Anthony, he didn't live very long. But anyway, if you have a chance to look at that, it's called New Bedford 100 years ago. And it's online. It's in all the online book companies. You could get look at it and see what he had to say about things. It's pretty interesting, actually. This is Dr. Tierney's house. Everybody remembers this as Dr. Tierney's house. He had a shingle down there someplace. His office was probably in the back. Anyway, this is one of New Bedford's great Gothic revivals here. A big house, probably done in the 1840s. That's what it says in the tax records. And I think that's probably accurate. Beautiful building. You can see all the decoration in the archway, which is typical of the style. Big giant arches everywhere. You can see the chimney is very cool too. The only problem with this house is painted white. It's always been painted white in my memory anyway. It hides a lot of the details when you paint everything white, which is kind of too bad. We're going to see a house in a minute, which is just the opposite of that, which is a great example of the use of paint. But nonetheless, this is a nice house, a big house too. It's one of the biggest. I mean, we're not going to go by the Rotch Cottage today, but everybody's kind of familiar with the Rotch Cottage on Irving Street. That's a big house as well, bigger than this one. And there's a lot of other nice Gothic revivals in the city. But this is probably the second biggest, and kind of, in my view, the second nicest as well. It's a really nice house. I'm not sure if the architect could be that famous architect that did the Rotch Cottage. His name was Alexander Jackson Davis Little. I don't know that for sure. But nonetheless, nice building, great scale. Look at the big pointed arch windows over the main entryway. Very cool. This house is the best paint job of a Victorian house in the city. And there may be some somewhere that I haven't seen that can match it, but this is the best use of paint on a Victorian in New Bedford. Colors are all accurate, all typical of what would be painted during that time. Every detail is picked out beautifully. It's in tip-top shape, as you can see, and its paint job is really a model of what houses in the 1870s and 80s would have looked like when they were done properly paint-wise. So lots of details on these houses, and they were meant to be seen, and this house picks them out. Now, the house itself, it's kind of an odd building, actually. 1890 is when the house was built, more or less, but it's an amalgam of styles. It actually has a lot of Gothic features, even though it's from the 1890s. Look, it has these on the columns, you can see the 4 posts put together as that's a Gothic feature all the way. The tower has a lot of features that are like, if you've been to Newport, Kingscote, which is a Newport mansion on Bedford, it's one of the smaller ones. It has the same shape as this house, really. But then again, we have this great Victorian porch. It's classified, I don't know if I would classify it as a Queen Anne, but that's what it's called now, because it's sort of an amalgam of styles. It was built during the Queen Anne period, and it has this beautiful porch, which is a nice Queen Anne detail. But really, there's a lot going on in this house. It's just the whole concept of the house is detail and so forth is quite different. But 1890, it has the eyebrow window. See the eyebrow window there? That is kind of an unusual feature. It's used a lot during the Colonial Revival period after 1900, but this is kind of an early use of it, really. It's almost to me, it's almost like a throw-in, because he didn't really need it with the dormers, but he wanted to put that detail in. Just a great building. The next house is the one right behind us. This one, the blue one here. And the detail I want to mention on this particular house, Colonial Revival was, most of the houses that we're going to see from now on are classified as Colonial Revivals. These are houses that mimicked the houses from the period of before the American Revolution and a little bit after. They were houses that were shingle-style, and they had the 2 floors and stuff, and they kind of embellished them quite a bit. This is the kind of a house that hasn't been embellished too much, but it's quite large. But the detail I want you to point out is this one. During the Victorian era, they used a lot of wrought iron fencing. Fencing was a big part of a property of these giant mansions. They had wrought iron fencing. But when they started with the Colonial Revival, they said, well, we can't use wrought iron fencing for fencing. What are we going to use? Stone walls. And so we have stone walls here. A lot of the Colonial Revivals on Hawthorn Street in particular had stone walls. There's still some remnants of those stone walls as you're going down Hawthorn Street here and there. But most of the big houses were surrounded by stone walls, which was in homage, really, of the stone walls that were so prominent in New England in particular during especially in our part of New England, where there's so many stones in the soil that they just dug them out when they were farming and used them as stone walls for barriers and so forth. So it's kind of a nice feature here, pretty fancy one actually, as stone walls from the 1890s go, which is when this house was built as well. Still one of the great Colonial Revivals in the city, a massive building, built in the 1890s. The man who built this house originally and owned this house originally was named Frederick Stetson. His wife was Helen Prescott. The Prescott family was very, very important in New Bedford at the time. Helen and her sister and brother are the people that gave the stained glass mural to the Unitarian Church. If everybody see the Unitarian Church mural, Tiffany mural inside behind the altar. 500,000 pieces of glass used to build that mill. And it was Helen Prescott Stetson and her brother Oliver and sister Molly that gave that to the Unitarian Church. Stetson was a lawyer. See the big giant gambrel, which mimics the gambrel houses that were in lots of houses in the gambrel style. Through usually 1.5 stories, not side the side of this house. But that's the kind of detail that they put in the Colonial Revival. This is an enormous house. It has a pool on the other side. It all looks great. This has been recently changed hands after it was loaned by the same guy who was pretty active in town, met for many years. It was always yellow and sort of with a black trim, which was kind of authentic, but wasn't as attractive as this color. I kind of like this better, actually, the green and white. This is the house that William D. Howland built in the mid-1880s. William D. Howland was the founder of the Howland Mill in the South End, Howland Place. Later on it was called the Gosnold Mill. But he established that mill. But unfortunately, he ran himself into financial scandal at the mill and committed suicide in 1897. The mill went belly up. That's when then the mill was sold to other owners, and it became the Gosnold Mill. But this whole block on this side, all the way up to Cottage Street, was land that was owned by his parents, Matthew and Rachael Howland. We're going to go buy their house. I'm not going to talk about that house today, but we're going to buy their house in a few minutes. And one of the first things that was purchased on, that was built on the land was across the street from them. The land was used as a nursery and farmland and so forth to support the estate. And one of the first buildings that was built on the estate was this house for William around 1885, I believe. It's a very odd style. I think he might have designed it himself, actually. There are some people who have speculated that the house has a big H in it, with the chimneys and the cross piece here is a big H for Howland. I'm not sure I buy into that completely, but some people say that's he put that in there. I think he probably did design the house. Whether that was meant as an H for Howland or not is debatable, but nonetheless, a huge place. I don't know how many rooms are in this house. Probably got to be 6,000, 7,000 square feet of space in this house, I would imagine. This thing's enormous. The house behind us here, really because of its location, its style, it's really kind of the quintessential Victorian. Everything about this house screams Victorian. It's a great porch with the turn columns. I bet you all those things in the square ones now, above and below, and the railings and in the fretwork, I bet you they were all turned at one point. They probably kind of rotted away, and rather than do all the turnings, they just put the regular square ones. But nonetheless, they replaced them anyway, and it's nice. But you can see the square, the turned columns. Everything about this house screams Victorian. It's just very cool. It has this great sight. Whoever built this house really wanted to make sure that people saw it and appreciated it as you're coming down Hawthorn Street. Just a very cool building. This is a classic Queen Anne style. The Queen Anne style was very, very popular and nice. There's not really as many Queen Annes in New Bedford as there are in some other cities. Some places you go, like Fall River even, which has a great collection of Victorians, has a lot more Queen Anne style houses than we do. I'm not sure what the reason for that is, but nonetheless, this is one of the best ones. The Queen Anne style usually has 3 levels of siding, and this house has the 3 levels of siding. It has the clapboards on the first level, it has shingles on the second level, and it has shaped shingles on the third level. That's kind of what the 3 things were. Sometimes they would use brick and other types of things on the third level, but the shaped shingle thing was pretty common as well. So this has all the elements of the Queen Anne. Very nice building. They've been taking care of it beautifully. It's a nice property for sure. And really, because of its location, probably one of the most recognizable houses in the city. You can't miss it, and you can't miss appreciating it, because you go by all the other nice houses on the street as you're coming up Hawthorn Street, because this one's staring at you, and it's always been beautiful. this is one of my favorite houses. Beautiful house. But before we get there, I want to talk about this. The Bluestone walkways. Now, New Bedford started to flag, as they called it, their sidewalks around the late 1820s. The streets were an awful mess because a lot of this is before running water, before sewer systems as well, and a lot of stuff from bedpans and anything else went in the street. It was pretty gross, actually. And so they wanted to make a barrier so people could walk back and forth and not be walking in mud and so forth. And they decided to flagstone the sidewalks with bluestone. And they were very proud of the fact that by the early 1830s, they had 31 miles of road. Now, the city wasn't that big at the time. Practically everything that was habitable near the downtown was flagged with bluestone. And there's some beautiful stones here. These are beautiful stones. These have been here probably since the 1830s or 40s. They kept on doing it until after the Civil War when they decided to go to concrete. But this is a beautiful stretch here. The stones are in good shape. A lot of the stones have been popped up by, like that one, those over there, by trees and so forth. But this is a nice little stretch of bluestone. Bluestone was a sedimentary sandstone. It was quarried in the Hudson River Valley. Maybe like, if you know the Hudson River Valley at all, Kingston, which is on the west side of the Hudson River, was the main port where the bluestone was distributed from the quarries that were inland in the Catskills. Anyway, New Bedford was very proud of its bluestone. There's some giant stones in front of the double bank building. There's a huge stone on Cottage Street about halfway down that when I did the tour, one of the Victorian tours, I highlighted that because it's one of the biggest ones I've ever seen. It's probably the size of maybe 3 or 4 of these all together in one spot. So it was a big deal, and the city was proud to have it. They decided that after the Civil War that concrete was going to be cheaper than bluestone, so after that the sidewalks were made of concrete. This house was built in the late 1830s, 1840. Beautiful Greek Revival style. It's in tip-top shape, always has been. Unfortunately, you can't see it really from the street. Doesn't face the street either, which is kind of too bad for the public because it's just a beautiful property. The original owner of this property was also named Joseph Grinnell, no direct relationship to the one we saw earlier. And Joseph G. Grinnell, who built this house, he owned a foundry in town. It was a very important business in the 1830s and 40s because there was so much metal work that was needed for the whaling industry and other industries as well, but particularly the whaling industry for all the tackles and blocks and so forth that were needed for it, and all the other types of metal work that was used. And he provided that service to the city. Now, the reason I mentioned Basil Brewer, he lived in this house as well from the 1830s until his wife was still living in the house when she passed away in the 1930s to the 1970s. And Basil Brewer was the owner of the Standard Times. He's the one who actually merged the New Bedford Times and the Evening Standard to form the Standard Times around 1932. He was a very controversial character in his day, actually. He had a lot of sway in town, pushed his weight around quite a bit, and was kind of a controversial character. But anyway, he lived in this house. Interesting guy, actually. I always wish that somebody would do their PhD dissertation on him so that we could learn more about him, because he was a very influential man during his lifetime in New Bedford. And most people that don't remember him because they lived through it never heard of him before. So it's kind of too bad. The historians have always wondered who designed this house. And to me, it's as easy as pie who designed this house, because it looks just like other houses by an architect by the name of Louis Détrempe. Louis Détrempe was a Canadian architect. He and his father started a business in Fall River, mostly the father, designed lots of buildings. Lewis came over here to actually finish the work on St. Anthony's Church. There was an architect that designed the church, failed. There was a catastrophic collapse of a couple of walls, and Louis de Tromp was brought in to finish St. Anthony's Church. Lewis also did the Star Store. What's the theater in the South End? No. The Orpheum. The Orpheum. Yep. Lots of other important buildings. And he did a lot of residences as well. And this house looks just like his residences. We're going to do one on the next tour. It's on Clinton Street that looks like this. And he's one of the only architects that consistently used stucco on his siding. So to me, there's no mystery who designed this house. It's Louis de Tromp. Looks like his own house, which is on Mount Pleasant Street, which sadly has been vinyl sided. But he has a number of houses in New Bedford, as well as various important buildings, public buildings, and I think for sure that he designed this house in 1916. The other rumor about this house, which is possible, I guess, but it's unfounded, is that these two Palladian windows here were taken from the Henry Huddleston Rogers estate when it was taken down in 1909. That's the other rumor about this house, the legend about this house is those windows are exactly the same ones that were Rogers' houses, and they took them, salvaged them, and put them in this house. You'll see that as a lot if you read anything about the architecture of this house or any other houses on the street. A favorite of mine, duplex, designed by Nat Smith, very, very famous New Bedford architect. Nat did so many houses in this neighborhood, Clinton Place, a few buildings downtown. Just New Bedford's really most important native-born architect. He did this house in the 1897 for a woman by the name of Agnes Wise. Agnes Wise shows up in all sorts of literature in footnotes. This is a house that was owned by Agnes Wise. I could never find any information about her. But she had this house commissioned by Smith to be a rental property, two-family. And one of our long-term Preservation Society board members, his name was Jim Barton. He lived in this house as well for a long, long time. I think he owned the house, actually. Shingle-style, great house. He did a number of others. There's a couple of others Agnes Wise houses on Hawthorn Street. Just a couple of houses down from where we're at the Queen Anne, where I was raving about in the corner. A few houses down on the south side were two-family, giant mansion-sized houses, but they're two-family houses, and she had Smith do a couple of those on that side as well. Don't know anything about Agnes Wise, but she must have had a lot of money because she was a major investor during the period after the 1880s and so of real estate here in New Bedford. That's my tour today. Does anybody have any final questions? Thank you for coming. I appreciate you coming, and nice day for a tour.